All right, so a couple things. Make sure number one that you completed yesterday from 19 section 2. So you got that quiz taken care of whenever we were going through that yesterday with our notes, kind of the makeup. If you're at home and you didn't get a chance, you can go back in there and watch the last one. I think it's labeled February the 11th recording. So then that way you have your chapter 19 2 notes and chapter 19 2 quiz that's done. Today, we're going to talk about page 542, and just kind of right now, all you got to do is kind of listen and kind of go through things. I'm going to turn up this air conditioner for a second. For some of y'all, look like you're freezing in here. But chapter 19, section 3 is again, like we've talked about before, really, really big because it sets up that big domino that's going to fall later down the line. And that's going to be Pearl Harbor, okay, of kind of the idea of why Japan built up this animosity toward people with westernized ideas, why they built up the animosity toward, the United States, the idea of Europe, the idea of people that were expanding and kind of causing a conflict to them. So the first question I'm going to ask you is there a positive isolationism? And is there a negative isolationism? And give me an example of one or the other. Positive isolationism, negative isolationism. Tell me one of each and kind of give me an example. Yes.
Positive, you don't have to worry about people sometimes.
Okay.
You kind of keep to yourself. They can't. Sometimes it can control people.
Okay. Like if I say a positive isolationism, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? Like, where would you be at? What are you? What's
Siberia.
You're isolated in Siberia, freezing cold?
The house because of COVID.
Okay. Well, is that a positive thing for you? Okay, so that's the negative one. So think about the positive one. Okay, exactly. That was my first thought. Like if I'm thinking positive isolationism, I'm thinking like, 2 weeks off, and I'm thinking I'm sitting on a beach in the Caribbean on my own private island, got the coconut tree, got the old hammock popped in there, all right? But I have my luxury resort all to myself sitting right here on the side, all right? Or it's some of you, you see those deals where it's like, would you live in this cabin with no electricity for a month? You know what I mean? Whether you wanted to get away from society, you wanted to get away from technology, you wanted to get away from just the hustle and bustle and just kind of relax. That would be your positive isolationism. What would be negative isolationism? Okay, you don't get to see the people you want to see, right? Yes, ma'am.
It's not like there's probably not enough room.
Okay.
Everybody to be on.
Okay. You wouldn't have a lot of people there because you'd be isolated by yourself. So maybe whatever segment that they gave you. So let's say this instance right here. You go to prison. Okay. Hopefully you don't ever go to prison, but if you go to prison, okay, you're with the general population. And then all of a sudden you get in trouble when you're in prison and you get isolated in solitary confinement. That's solid isolation. All right. A lot of people that get there due to the lack of non-social contact, whether you don't see the sun, you don't see other humans, you get 15 minutes outside on a concrete pad by yourself a day, that's it. You start kind of going crazy because of the idea of isolation. So that's one extreme to the other extreme, right? A deserted island in the Caribbean or in an isolation jail cell. Complete big differences in those two. So Japan was wanting to isolate itself from westernized ideas from Europe. Why would you want to isolate yourself from another country? So I'll give you this example. You tell me this one. Do you think that I let my kids watch anything that's on Netflix? No. I mean, they're 9 and 11. Okay, so I have a sign in and they have a sign in. Okay, and they click on that one, it only shows up to this rating. I click on mine, I can watch whatever I want to watch. Okay, same thing that goes back and forth. All right, so there's a moderation that goes on there. All right, your house. How many of you have a fence around your backyard? Well, most everybody's got some form of fence around their backyard. All right, why do you have a fence around your backyard? Okay, it's your backyard, right? It's yours. Okay. I don't want my neighbor coming into my backyard. All right. I don't want my neighbor seeing into my backyard. What else is another reason why? Yeah, like you got pets. Okay, so you got some pets that are in there. All right, or maybe you got a garden or something else going in there. You don't want other animals coming in that you don't want in there. All right, you don't want other things coming in that you don't want in there. You want it clearly defined that that's your space. Okay, so you go to the same idea of how many gates are normally on a backyard fence. Okay, 1 to 2, right? You don't have this gate after gate after gate after gate because something's going to happen. Wind's going to blow. It's going to open it up. It's going to break a hinge. Next thing you know, it's sitting sideways and people can still get into your backyard. All right. We'll use that instance here in just a second when we talk about the idea of, kind of port isolationism, trying to go through there. Okay. So one of the big parts I'm going to pop up here in just a second. Let me trade this over. Whenever we get to, there we go. The idea of Japan is kind of setting the mood. I'm going to tell you a quote that kind of goes along with it. I want you to think about how your overall feeling of this quote would be, and if it makes sense to you, if it's something that, if you were ruled by force, okay? If you were ruled by force, what does that mean? If you're ruled by force, it says rule the empire by force. All right, that was one of the main ways the daimyo were ruling. What would be the positive impact of ruling by force, and what would be the negative impact of ruling by force? Would you rather someone tell you, do this now? Or would you rather have someone tell you, these are your options? Okay, these are your options. Okay. Yeah. I mean, both of them are right. You know what I mean? As far as learning. So why would sometimes it be good for you to have someone to tell you, do this now? Okay. Might have been through it before. Okay. Cut to the chase, right? So instead of maybe you running 5 circles around this way to get to point B, you go straight from point A to point B because they say, do this. This is how it works. Okay. Same way with force. If someone says, do this or you die, is that a good way to rule? Yeah. The people won't like you, right? Because if you're the one that's made an example of, there's a lot of people mad, but does it work?
Yes.
Pretty much. You know what I mean? It works until a rebellion happens. But the idea of if someone says, don't walk out that door or else you fall into the abyss, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of people trying to walk out the door. You know what I mean? So you get your point across and you get what it is. But the other part of ruling by force, if you're the person delivering the force or you're the people that are around in good cahoots with the people, everything's good. But who suffers the most? The normal people, right? Everybody that's just the peasantry, the middle class, the normal everyday thing that drives the society. So ruling by force is kind of hard unless you're up on the top side of that. A lot like feudalism with the king and the lords and the nobles. All right? That was good for them, but it was bad for everybody else that was in there. All right? So Japan returning to isolationism. It says in the 1300s, the unity that had been achieved in Japan in the previous century had broken down. Basically, they go into the civil war because the idea of shoguns, the military leaders that were going through, they start having this internal conflict of who should be in charge. Turns into a North versus South. Right? So from our instance of what we know as a civil war in the United States, is a civil war productive for a country? No, because in the end, all you're doing is destroying yourself, and you have to pay to rebuild yourself. Okay, so the same part was happening with Japan. These two rival courts later came back together, and in the end of the century, a series of political weak shoguns lost all of that control of them coming back together, and it kind of slips up. Now, it says the whole land was torn by factional strife and economic unrest. It would be centuries before Japan would again be unified. So what's on the board here, and it says, how did each of the following help to unify Japan? I'm going to pop this up there. Wrong one. There we go. The daimyo, and then multiple names, 2 and 3 and 4 that go along with Toyotomi Hideyoshi. There's going to be a couple other major ones that are going to be in there. If I can get the picture up there on the board, other parts are gone. So what you're going to do after we get through talking here is you're going to find out how did each one of these 4 help to unify Japan. All right, we'll talk about number 1. In the next part, with 5, 6, 7, and 8, you're going to see how did each of these following influence what would happen with Japanese society and culture. Okay, and that'll end up being what'll be your notes for chapter 19, section 3 that's there. Okay, the daimyo were lords in this new kind of Japan, as in the warlords themselves. And basically, if you look back at the feudal system, like in Europe, they were the upper part of the triangle and everybody else was below them. But because they were in power, how did they help unify Japan? They were the ones that were in charge, that ruled over the lower class. Okay, and that's going to be their big pushing point. A lot of these people were like old samurai warriors. So the idea of a military idea of rule, that was a big push on that side. And it keeps going on, to a couple more ideas of feudalistic leaders, and how they set out. They kind of build the same idea of what old school Europe was, with with building castles, passing down family lineage from one ruler to the next, and you start to see how Japan's kind of set back in time, kind of more of the Middle Age style of Europe versus the other way. But society had a good idea about where they fit. There was an upper class, there was a middle, very thin middle, and there was a lot of lower that was there. Okay. In the end, though, farming starts to kind of go to the wayside, and this idea of trade and opening up is a big, big deal. They start to trade with Europe. All right, now let's kind of follow how Europe works out, because you know the answers to these. How did European trade work out for Africa? Not very good, okay? Because you have slavery, you have conquering, you have decolonization, a lot of bad stuff. All right. How did European colonization work out for North America, the people that were already there? Not very good, okay? All the way down to the Trail of Tears, okay? Loss of land, all the other stuff that goes along with what we'll get into as we get closer to U.S. history. Okay, what about South America? European colonization in South America, how'd that work out for them? Not very good, okay? So Japan lets in Europeans, but in the end, they were really smart because they isolated themselves from the Europeans, okay? They got lucky on that part right there. India didn't fare very well either by the time you get through with British rule. So Japan isolated itself to kind of avoid all of this stuff that was going on. One of the big things that Europe was trying to get accomplished was the idea of missionaries. So what's the root word for a missionary? Mission. They were on a mission to spread Christianity, okay? But the idea of a missionary was also to refine the barbarians, refine the unethical civilizations that are out there. If people weren't good enough to be Europeans, they weren't good enough people. So therefore, they needed some reform in the idea of Christianity. But it also helped unify their powers based upon a God rather than this government, this government, this government. All right. So that was another big thing to push through. All right. So why, as we go through this, why would you regulate what is in your ports? Why would you regulate what's in your country? We go back to the civilization deal we talked about with the fence around your place. All right. Japan had all of these ports open. And they say, all right, too much European influence. There's too much stuff going on here. This idea of Christianity is going on too much. And they start outlawing Christianity. Then they come back in and they say, all right, all of these ports that we're profiting from, we're going to close it down to one. And only one port is available. Why would they do that? Yeah, so they can control what comes in. They can control what goes out. They can control who gets what comes in. Say, for instance, if I'm trading for guns, I can control specifically, does the North get the guns or did the South get the guns? Do the elites get the guns? Okay. If there's certain trade items that come in, I can hoard those items and make them more or less valuable based upon supply and demand of those items. I could also control what Europeans came in, what kind of influence of the type of people that were in there. All right. The other big thing that goes along with, and you think about our same idea of security, you know what I mean? We still go with the same reasons. Of countries that you see with like border security, about why they want to have border security, the same way the Japanese wanted one port of entry back then. All right. They want to maintain what goes in and what goes out. All right. Here's the next step that was pretty crazy that was taken by the Japanese, though. You were not allowed to leave the Japanese country, go to another country, and come back. Okay? Why do you think they do that? You weren't allowed to leave and go anywhere else off the island and come back. You could leave, but you could never come back. Okay? So what's dangerous about that? Influence, right? If someone turns into a negative influence about the westernized ideas, this is what they're doing in Europe and it's working for them. We should do this here. They didn't want to mess with the solid old school type culture that the Japanese culture was established on. Okay. They didn't want to bring out these new radical westernized ideas. Okay. About where the idea of women were, where the idea of what work was going to be, the progressive nature of not having to necessarily follow everything the government says based upon what your religion says, all of these things that would contradict the style that the Japanese had for this whole time. So they really wanted to. Have you ever met someone that was like really censored and really coddled and sheltered as a kid, and then all of a sudden they go to college or they go to high school somewhere different? What happens to them usually? They usually go crazy. I'm not like mentally crazy, like freedom, here we go. And they were trying out everything. Okay. So the idea of, the Japanese trying to curtail that in, trying to keep their culture, the same way of exactly where they should be at right there. All right? Those are the biggest parts of this. It says for more than 200 years, Japan remained basically closed to all Europeans. In addition, the Japanese were forbidden to leave, like we talked about, so as not to bring back any of the foreign ideas. Japan would continue to develop, but as a self-sufficient country. They want to make sure that everyone knew that they could rely on themselves, free from European attempts to colonize or establish their presence. And again, looking back on it, it's not a bad idea. Worked out pretty good for them versus the other three examples that we gave. Europeans were met with much resistance in their efforts to open east to trade, but an expansion to the west would eventually get it. There's another huge domino that falls because there was no longer any further eastward to go for the Europeans. Well, let's try out the other side of the ocean. And then that leads what turns into the United States, 13 colonies, westernization, sliding over, spreading back into war with old Eastern values that were the same thing. Okay. The same way that the Europeans were kicked out of the eastern part of the Eastern Hemisphere is the same reason why now we're the westernized values and people want to go to war with us based upon the idea of progressivism. All right. So what I want you to do today is with the 4 boxes that are at the top, how did each of the following help unify Japan? All right. Find a statement that tells within chapter 19, section 3, how they unified Japan. What did they do? Were they a military leader? Were they the ideas of providing stability for Japan? And then on the bottom 4, how did each of the following influence their society? Could be positive, could be negative. Okay. Portuguese, heavily influenced in by the impact of trade, by the goods that were given, and the ideas from westernization. Closed country policy heavily affected the people of Japan because they were no longer allowed to leave. They had to rely upon themselves, and they built a strong foundation of nationalism. Okay. So some of those things kind of go on. We talked about Christian missionaries. So there's about 3 of the 4 that are there. Anyway, fill in those with your quote. Chapter 19, section 3 quiz. You may use this one open. Okay. We're not going to take it again tomorrow in the morning or the first part of the class that we get here, but you're going to answer chapter 19, section 3. It has to go along with a bunch of these names. So do it as an open quiz, and you'll have 19-3 that you'll complete on there. Okay. Any questions? Everybody good? All right.